In Arizona, there was an Apache woman so large that every time she crossed the bridge, the wooden planks let out a low groan. The men sitting in the saloon liked to joke behind her back, until one rainstorm, one flash flood, and one cry for help quieted them for good. Only the owner of the little diner remained in his kitchen, hands trembling as he poured coffee, realizing his heart had just given itself to the woman the whole town once feared. The town was called Dry Crossing, small enough that if you stood in front of Thomas Reed's general store, you could see nearly everything. The wooden bridge stretching across a shallow riverbed, the red dust clearing beyond it, the horse stalls, and the low buildings lining the main road. By day, the red dust rose whenever a wagon passed, clinging to shirts, hair, and even the laughter of people long accustomed to the heat. By night, the temperature dropped sharply. But day or night, the town moved to one familiar rhythm: footsteps on the wooden bridge. Among all those footsteps, there was one person everyone recognized from sound alone: Aiyana Grayhawk. Ayana was Apache. She was taller than most men in the region, broader in the shoulders than many who had hauled freight their entire lives. When she stood straight, her shadow stretched across half the bridge. Her arms were strong enough to lift one end of a timber two other men struggled to drag. When she set foot on the planks, the wood groaned, not because it was about to break, but as if it understood it was carrying the weight of a life built on hard labor. Thomas Reed watched this sight every day from the doorway of his diner. His place was small, holding only a few tables, serving coffee, biscuits, stew, and some general goods. He had been a widower for years. His only son had moved to another state, leaving Thomas with a wooden counter and an aging stove. Most of his customers were miners, wagon drivers, and passing traders. They ate quickly, spoke loudly, laughed hard, then moved on. But one thing Thomas could always count on seeing every morning and afternoon was Aiyana's silhouette crossing the bridge. Around midday, Thomas would stand behind the counter, wiping glasses as he glanced toward the end of the bridge. When he heard the heavy groan of the planks once, then twice, then 3 times, he knew it could only be her. Sometimes a man in the diner would grumble, "One of these days that bridge is gonna snap under her." The others would roar with laughter. Another would add, "I swear, never seen a woman that big. If she sits on a chair, the chair better pray." They slapped tables, emptied mugs, and kept laughing. Thomas heard it all. He could have laughed along, but he didn't find it funny. Not because their jokes were cruel, but because he knew that behind that large frame was a woman who rarely lifted her head. Whenever she passed the diner, she never looked inside. She focused on her wagon, her ropes, her horse, as if she wished to be invisible, only her arms and legs allowed to exist for the sake of work. The first day Thomas spoke to her wasn't a remarkable one. No storm, no flood. Just a dusty afternoon. Ayana hauled a wagon of lumber across the bridge and stopped in front of the diner to check her ropes. From the doorway, Thomas saw the sweat on her brow and, without thinking, poured a cup of water. When she turned her wagon to leave, he stepped onto the porch. "Ayana." She looked up, surprised. "You called me?" Her voice was deep, low, yet surprisingly gentle for a woman of her size. "Do you want some water? It's free. Too hot today." Ayana looked at the cup, then at Thomas, as if questioning whether this was a trick. After a moment, she said quietly, "If you have extra, I'll take it." She held the cup carefully, like she feared she might crush it. Her fingers were broad and rough, yet her movements were cautious. She took a few sips and handed it back. "Thank you." Thomas nodded. "Do you haul lumber every day?" "Most days. Folks pay me to cross the river for them. I'm used to it." Thomas glanced at the bridge. "It's sturdier than it looks. You don't have to worry." Ayana pressed her lips together, and for the briefest moment a hint of dry humor flickered in her eyes. "I'm more worried for the bridge than it is for me." Thomas chuckled, not loudly, just enough for her to know he understood. And for the first time, he saw the corner of her mouth lift. It wasn't a full smile, but it softened her stern face in a way that surprised him. That night, when the diner was empty, Thomas sat alone in the kitchen thinking about her words. Her whole life, she must have been too big, too strong, too much for what people expected of a woman. No wonder she talked little, smiled rarely, walked fast, finished her work, and moved on, never staying long enough for anyone to see past the muscles and the weight. In the days that followed, Thomas began setting aside a small pastry on the counter around the time she crossed the bridge. When she stopped to check her ropes, he would push the pastry toward the porch. "If you're not in a hurry, eat this before you go." She frowned. "You keep feeding me. Aren't you afraid you'll go broke?" Thomas shrugged. "Things go stale if they sit too long. Better they're useful to someone." Ayana stared at him a long moment, then took the pastry. "I'll pay you. Don't give me things for free all the time." Thomas smiled. "Pay me when you're rich. Just remember to bring a good story with the money." She didn't respond, but as she pushed her wagon across the bridge, she glanced back at the diner. It was the first time he had ever seen her look his way, instead of keeping her eyes on the road. Inside, the men kept up their usual remarks. "Reed, you keep feeding her. That bridge is gonna cry for mercy. Aren't you scared she'll get mad one day and toss your whole diner in the river?" Thomas only shook his head. No use arguing. He wiped tables, poured coffee, and occasionally glanced toward the bridge. Every time Ayana walked across, he listened to the sound of the planks, and a quiet thought crossed his mind. One he never dared say aloud. If something ever happens to that bridge, she'll be the first one to hold it together. He didn't yet know how right he would be, and he certainly didn't know that someday, not just the bridge, but his own heart would be held together by that giant Apache woman in a way he never imagined. Afternoons in Dry Crossing carried a rhythm all their own. The wind whipping against the diner sign, boots crunching through red dust, wagon wheels grinding over the wooden bridge, and the long breaths of men who had worked under the sun since dawn. But for the past few weeks, another sound had joined that daily symphony. It was the measured, heavy steps of Ayana as she set her broad, steady feet onto the planks, each step carrying the quiet heartbeat of this dry land. And Thomas, though he never said it aloud, always heard her footsteps before he ever saw her silhouette. Some days she came early, some late, but she always paused for a few minutes at the end of the bridge to check her reins, tighten the ropes, or secure the load in the back of her wagon. During those moments, Thomas would appear at the doorway almost without thinking, carrying a pastry or a cup of hot coffee depending on the weather. At first, Ayana seemed shy about accepting anything from him, but slowly she grew used to it. One day he stepped onto the porch with a warm cup and said, "Fog was thick last night. Drink this before you go." Ayana looked at the pale blue sky, then at the cup, as if weighing whether this was trouble or kindness. Finally she said, "I do not want to bother you." Thomas smiled. "You don't bother me. In this town, if I make a cup of coffee and no one drinks it, I'm the one who ends up lonely." Ayana took the cup. "Mr. Reed, you are strange." But her tone was not offended at all. It was a quiet way of saying thank you. After that, she stopped for a few minutes every time she crossed the bridge. Not long, not overly familiar, but long enough to build a habit. And to people who had been lonely for years, habits often became the first threads tying two hearts together. One blistering afternoon, Ayana pushed her wagon toward the bridge, sweat rolling down her brow. Thomas was by the doorway kneading dough when he heard her distinct footsteps. He set the bowl aside and stepped out with 2 cups of water. Ayana set her wagon down and braced her hands on her hips, her shirt damp with sweat. Thomas handed her a cup. "It's unbearably hot today." Ayana drank half the cup in one breath and sighed. "I hauled lumber all morning. Folks say it might drizzle tomorrow, but I don't trust it." Thomas looked toward the empty riverbed. Every time the sky promises rain, dry crossing changes its mind. Ayana let out a low laugh. "You're right." They fell quiet for a moment, listening to familiar sounds. A horse flicking its tail, wheels scraping dirt, the wind carrying the scent of hot earth. Thomas brushed dust off the porch. "Walking this route every day, does it ever wear you out?" Ayana set the cup down. "It does, but I'm used to it. And not everyone here hires Apache workers. When someone hires me, I have to do my best." Thomas looked at her with a softness that matched the late afternoon sun. "I don't think they hire you because you're Apache." Ayana tilted her head. "Then why?" "Because you work well. Simple as that." She froze for a moment. It was a plain sentence, but it sounded like something no one had ever told her before. She turned the cup in her hands and said quietly, "When I was young, I was different from other girls. My mother said I was strong like the mountain wind. But in town, people said I did not look like a woman." Thomas paused, then asked with genuine curiosity, "Were those people good?" "No." "Then why believe them?" Ayana stared at him longer than usual. "Mr. Reed, you can call me Thomas. Thomas, you speak strangely. Has anyone ever told you that strange can be comforting?" A faint smile touched her lips. It wasn't large or bright, but soft. Thomas noticed it instantly. Anyone would have. But he didn't say more, sensing that too many words might make her retreat. Another afternoon, Thomas was fixing the diner sign when the wind blew dust into his eyes. Ayana stopped her wagon and watched him struggle with the ladder. "Let me help." "It's all right. I can manage." Ayana stepped closer, placed one hand on the ladder, and held it so firmly Thomas felt it sink half an inch deeper into the ground. "Now you can." He climbed up, straightened the sign, and when he came down, he said, "You held it a bit too strong." "Habit. Where I come from, the wind is fiercer than here. The wind here is strong enough to make a man realize he's not young anymore." Ayana studied him, then asked, "How old are you?" 47. "Old." Thomas burst out laughing. "You don't have to be that honest. Among my people, we speak truth. How old are you then?" 41. "So you're much younger than I am." Ayana frowned. "Where?" Thomas shrugged. "In my heart." She turned away, but Thomas saw her ears turn red. Gradually, her stops grew longer, a few more minutes, then a few more. She sat on the porch bench when he offered. She ate the small pastries he saved for her. She returned every cup she drank from. She asked him about the diner. He asked her about the mountain trails. Little things, small pieces of everyday life, dropping between them like pebbles, creating ripples on still water. One day, as she prepared to leave, Thomas asked, "Will you pass this way tomorrow?" Ayana gave him a curious look. "Tomorrow, I am paid to build a fence on the north side. I will take the long route, not the bridge." Thomas nodded, trying to keep his voice steady. "I just wanted to know." Ayana narrowed her eyes, as if she could see straight through the simple sentence. "You want to know, or you want to wait?" Thomas answered honestly in one word. "Wait." Ayana said nothing. She climbed onto her wagon and snapped the reins. But after a few yards, she turned back. "I will take this road tomorrow afternoon." "But you said..." I will take this road. That is all." Thomas smiled. And the next day, true to her word, Ayana crossed the bridge. Not for work, not because anyone hired her, but because someone on the diner porch was waiting. And though neither of them said it aloud, they both knew this simple truth. Waiting is something we only do for the things that matter. June arrived that year with a dry heat so harsh, the red dust settled on everything like a thin layer of chalk. The river that ran through Dry Crossing held almost no water, only long cracked streaks beneath the bridge. Folks joked that if the weather stayed dry for a few more weeks, they could walk across the riverbed without needing the wooden bridge at all. Ayana still crossed it every day, her wagon still heavy, her horse still patient, the bridge still groaning in its familiar way beneath her steps. Everything was ordinary, until that afternoon. That day, the air carried a strange scent. Not dust, not hot earth, but something old and distant. The smell of rain coming. Ayana crossed the bridge earlier than usual, her deliveries finished, and she felt the wind shifting with moisture. Thomas stood on the diner porch, wiping his hands on his apron as he watched the sky to the west. A vast, dark cloud stretched across the horizon like a rolling mountain, moving faster than a herd of cattle on the run. "It looks like it's going to rain for real," Thomas said as Ayana stopped her wagon. She looked up. "A heavy one. You should wait it out here. Rain like this. That dry river will fill in minutes." Ayana shook her head. "I need to get home before it falls." Thomas nodded. He understood. Everyone in this part of Arizona knew that a dry river could turn into a furious beast within half an hour if storms fell on the mountains. Flash floods here were not like anywhere else. The water arrived fast as someone running from the night. Ayana flicked the reins, but she had barely moved a few yards when a shout rang out from the far end of the bridge. "Stop! Don't go on the bridge!" Thomas jerked his head up. A man was sprinting toward them, pale as fireplace ash. "A wagon is stuck in the middle of the bridge!" Thomas ran out from the porch and looked. Sure enough, in the very center of the bridge sat a small wagon rocking dangerously. The horse hitched to it was panicked, stomping on the planks. Inside the wagon were two people, an elderly woman and a little girl, no older than 6 or 7. The child was screaming while the woman tried desperately to hold the reins steady. Then Thomas heard a sound that made his blood run cold, a sharp crack beneath the bridge. One of the main support beams snapped and fell into the dry riverbed, and in the same instant, the sky tore open. A blast of thunder rolled over the town, and rain poured down as if someone had overturned the whole sky. Thomas shouted, "Ayana, don't go out there!" But she either didn't hear him or chose not to. She had already leapt off her wagon and was charging toward the bridge. The raindrops were the size of beans, hitting her shoulders and back like stones, but she didn't slow. She ran as if the earth were burning beneath her feet. The bridge shook violently when she stepped onto it. From upstream, water surged into the riverbed, filling it in seconds. The rise was so fast, Thomas couldn't believe what he was seeing. On the bridge, the frightened horse kicked at the planks. The old woman cried out, "We're stuck! The bridge is going to break." Thomas began to run after Ayana, but fear pulled at him like a hard wind from behind. Fear of the water, fear of the bridge collapsing, fear of losing her. Ayana, however, moved forward without hesitation. No, moved wasn't the right word. She threw herself into danger like it was all she had ever known to do. As she reached the midpoint of the bridge, a large panel beneath her split open. The entire structure tilted left. The old woman clutched the child, screaming over the roar of rain. Ayana didn't answer. She crouched, slid one arm beneath a loosened support beam, and lifted with everything in her. The entire bridge shuddered. but it held. She held it. Rain lashed her back, water rising beneath her boots, but she didn't move an inch. Thomas shouted from the bank, "Ayana, fall back! It's going to collapse!" Her voice cut through the storm, steady, powerful, absolute. No, not until they're off. She called toward the trapped wagon, "Send the girl first." The old woman was trembling so badly she could hardly move, but she finally set the child on the planks. The girl slipped, sliding toward a gap, but Ayana released one hand from the beam, reached out, and caught her as gently as if she were catching a falling leaf. "Run to the bank," she said. The girl clung to her leg for a heartbeat, as if Ayana were the only solid thing left in the world. Then she stumbled toward Thomas. She fell twice as the bridge lurched, but Thomas ran forward and lifted her into his arms. Only the old woman remained. The water had risen to half the height of the bridge, battering the planks with the force of a storm. Another loud crack echoed. Thomas knew Ayana couldn't hold the structure much longer. "Ayana, let go! Move back!" But she shouted to the woman instead, "Take my hand!" The old woman shook so violently she could barely stand. The wagon tilted, the horse broke free and plunged into the raging water. Ayana didn't think. She lifted her leg, still holding the beam with one arm, and reached with the other. "Give me your hand. Now!" Finally, the woman grabbed hold. Ayana pulled her free of the wagon, clutching her against her chest like a child. Then, in a moment Thomas would never forget, she swung the woman over her shoulder, with a strength no man in town could have summoned even on the calmest day, and ran for the bank as the bridge disintegrated piece by piece beneath her. Thomas met them halfway. As soon as Ayana set the woman down, the bridge behind her collapsed completely, swallowed by the roaring water in less than 3 seconds. The whole town stood on both banks, stunned into silence. Ayana stood there panting, rain streaming down her face, her hair plastered to her shoulders, her arms reddened from the strain of holding the beam. But she didn't fall, not even a little. Thomas slipped his coat around her shoulders, even though she towered over him by nearly a head. He spoke softly, so only she could hear. "I told you you were the strongest one here." Ayana looked up at him. In the rain, her eyes held no pride, no fury, only surprise. Surprise that for the first time in her life, while standing before the very people who once mocked her, no one laughed, no one joked, no one looked away. The whole town was silent, and all they saw was a giant Apache woman who had saved a collapsing bridge and the lives upon it with her bare hands. The rain eased after the flash flood, but the sound of rushing water still echoed in the riverbed, a reminder that what had happened was no brief nightmare. The river that had been dry for months had filled in a single afternoon. The wooden bridge, the small pride of dry crossing, was now only half of what it once was, the rest carried away by the current. People stood along the riverbank, watching shattered planks drift off into the distance, their expressions clouded with something none of them wished to name, gratitude or the shame of having once mocked the woman who had just saved them. Ayana stood a short distance away, her shoulders and back still trembling from the immense strain she had borne. The cold wind swept across her drenched clothes, making her shiver, but she remained upright. Thomas hated the sight of it. He stepped forward and draped his thickest coat over her shoulders again, this time pulling it close enough that she could not refuse the warmth. "You can't stand out here like this. Come inside." Ayana shook her head slightly. "I'm fine." Thomas looked directly at her, his voice low but firm. "Ayana, you're shaking, and I am not fine watching you like this." She froze for a moment. Something softened behind her eyes, as if no one had ever spoken to her that way. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with genuine concern she couldn't brush aside. At last, she nodded. All right. Thomas brought her inside. When she stepped through the wooden door, the room seemed to shrink around her tall frame, yet it grew warmer at the same time. Thomas pulled out a chair. Sit down. Ayana hesitated, as though afraid the chair might splinter beneath her. Is it sturdy? Thomas chuckled. I built it. It can handle more than we think. Sit. She lowered herself onto the seat, leaning slightly as the shivering continued. Thomas set a warm cloth on the table. Your hand is scraped up. Let me see. No need. Ayana. She stopped. Just hearing him say her name like that, warm, slow, tinged with irritation, but built from worry, left her with no room to argue. She held out her hand. As Thomas wrapped the bandage, her large, powerful hands rested in his like something precious. She wasn't used to this. She was used to people avoiding touch, or only touching her when they needed her strength, not because they were afraid she might be hurt. Thomas worked patiently, cleaning each cut as gently as if he feared he might hurt a child. You stunned everyone out there, he said softly. I did not want that. You just wanted to save them. Ayana stared at her palms. I did it because they are human. Everyone is worth saving. Thomas paused for a heartbeat. What about you? She looked up. What do you mean? You're worth saving too. Ayana swallowed. I don't need saving. I've always managed on my own. Managing on your own isn't always enough, Thomas said gently. She said nothing. Her whole life she had been the one people needed, the one they called when strength was required, the one they relied on for heavy work. No one had ever said she deserved to be cared for. Thomas tied the final knot of the bandage. All done. Rest a little. I'll make something warm. Ayana shook her head out of habit. I'm not hungry. Thomas gave her a look so soft yet stern that she suddenly felt like a child caught lying. Everyone gets hungry after holding up a bridge. Ayana laughed, deep and quiet but sincere. You talk too much. Yes, especially when you refuse to take care of yourself. She lowered her gaze, revealing something Thomas had sensed for a long time. Beneath all that strength was a woman who could still feel shy, embarrassed, grateful. Thomas brought out hot food, cornbread, bean stew, and a steaming cup of coffee. Ayana looked at the meal, her voice low. Shata Thomas, why are you doing so much for me? Because I want you here. Because I want you warm. Because... He stopped himself. The truth was simple. Because he had been waiting for the sound of her footsteps on the bridge every day. Because her presence made his diner feel less empty. Because she made him feel like a man again. Not just a forgotten cook with a small town to his name. But he didn't say all that. Not yet. Ayana straightened and picked up the spoon. I'll eat. Thank you. Thomas nodded and stepped back, though his eyes remained on her, not in worry, but as if memorizing the moment. The giant Apache woman who had held up a collapsing bridge now sitting in his diner, eating a meal he had prepared, looking for all the world as though this little room might be a place she could finally set her burdens down. By the time she finished eating, the rain outside had faded into soft drops tapping on the tin roof. Ayana stood. I owe you for this meal. Thomas shook his head. No, you owe nothing. She tightened the coat around her shoulders. Then, I owe you something else. What is it? He asked gently. Ayana hesitated, her eyes warming like a slow-burning ember. Tomorrow, I will come help you rebuild the bridge. I won't take pay. Thomas smiled. Ayana, the whole town owes you, not the other way around. She replied in a calm, steady voice. I am not doing it for them. Thomas stood very still. Then, carefully, As though not to disturb the moment, he asked, "Then, who are you doing it for?" Ayana did not answer. She only looked at him long enough that time seemed to pause around them. Then she turned, opened the diner door, and stepped into the cool night without another word. But Thomas knew. He knew with more certainty than anything he had ever known. She had already given him the answer, in her silence. And for the first time in many years, his heart did not feel cold anymore. The next morning, Dry Crossing woke to the smell of wet wood and dust washed clean from the ground. The once empty river was still running high from the flood, stronger than it had been in years. Broken planks had drifted onto the banks, and several support posts lay torn from their foundations. The wooden bridge the town had relied on for decades now existed only as a twisted frame clinging to the near side of the river. Townsfolk stood along the bank, shaking their heads, sighing not just over the loss of the bridge but over the truth they all knew. Had it not been for Ayana last night, they would be facing something far worse. Thomas opened the diner early, lit the stove, and brewed coffee. Cold morning air rolled through the doorway, carrying the sound of rushing water. But it wasn't the river he was listening for. It was the sound of footsteps he had thought about all night. The familiar weight he had grown used to hearing on the bridge. Around 8 o'clock, he finally heard it. Heavy steps, but muted this time by damp ground instead of wooden planks. Ayana came up the road, her long black hair tied low, arms full of tools, shoulders wrapped in a worn coat. She walked straight to the broken bridge. No greeting, no hesitation, studying the damage with sharp, steady eyes. Thomas watched from the porch, then grabbed a pot of hot coffee and headed toward her. "You're early," he said. "I could not sleep," she replied without looking up. He held the pot toward her. "Drink some, it's still cold out." Ayana took a sip and set the pot on a log. "Most of the bridge is gone. Without repairs, folks on the far side will have to ride 3 miles around." Thomas nodded. "Then we fix it." She turned to him with a puzzled look. You are helping?" "I am not as strong as you, but I know how to cut boards, use pliers, swing a hammer, and I know no one should work alone this morning." She said nothing, but her small nod spoke louder than any thank you. Within hours, the townspeople began to arrive. Some brought hammers, some brought nails, some simply stood there, guilt plain in their eyes, as they remembered every joke they had once made about Ayana. They spoke little, but each one stepped forward, asking her what needed doing. For the first time in years, Ayana worked among a crowd without feeling their stares like weight on her back. Thomas stayed beside her, passing nails, holding the ladder, lining up boards. She lifted heavy beams as if they were branches, and Thomas could not resist teasing her. "You know, if you really wanted to, you could lift the whole bridge up and set it on the other side." Ayana shot him a sideways glance. "Is that a compliment or an insult?" "Both. You are not afraid I will hit you?" Thomas laughed. "Of course I am, but I think you would hit lightly." She did not smile outright, but her eyes held a spark like sunlight flickering on water. By noon, townspeople brought food. The old woman from the night before arrived too, carrying a basket of cornbread. "Child, you saved my life yesterday." Ayana answered simply, "I did what needed doing." The woman shook her head. "No, you saved us." She held out the basket. Ayana looked unsure, awkward even, until Thomas placed a steady hand on her shoulder, reminding her she deserved to receive just as much as she gave. All afternoon, they worked. By the time the sun dipped low and turned the river gold, most of the bridge stood rebuilt. Not as pretty as before, but stronger. When Ayana stepped onto the new planks to test them, the bridge barely shivered. Thomas watched her tall figure cast a long shadow across the fresh boards and felt something peaceful settle in his chest. She belonged here. As evening crept in, people began to leave. Ayana stayed on the bridge, watching the river recede. Thomas joined her, crossing his arms on the rail. "The water should be low again tomorrow," he said. Ayana nodded. "This river is quick, rises fast, falls fast. Like you," she turned. "Like me, how? You come like the wind, strong enough to steady a bridge. Then you pull back the moment everything is safe." She said nothing. The breeze lifted strands of her hair, pressing them against her cheek. Thomas looked at her the way a man looks at something he has finally come to understand. She wasn't strong because she could lift beams. She was strong because she never once asked to be loved. She never stayed long enough anywhere to believe she could be. That was when Thomas finally voiced the question he had been holding since last night. "Ayana, where do you plan to go after we finish the bridge?" She lowered her gaze to her calloused hands. "I have work up north. When it is done, I move on." "Move on to where?" "I do not know. I go where people need me." Thomas took a slow breath, though his eyes carried weight. "What about dry crossing? People here need you too. This bridge needs you." Ayana shook her head, almost gently. "They do not need me, Thomas. They need my strength. That is different. It is always the same." He stepped closer. "What about me?" Ayana looked up in surprise. You need my strength?" Thomas shook his head. "I need you. Your presence. This town could rebuild that bridge 10 times, but I do not want to replace the habit of seeing you cross it every day." Ayana stared at him, unsure whether to believe him. She had known only teasing, whispered comments, half smiles of fear or amusement. But Thomas's eyes held none of that. They were warm, true, and steady. She breathed in slowly. "You are asking me to stay here?" Thomas did not answer with words. He reached out and touched the back of her hand, very gently, as though asking permission to step into the part of her life she kept locked away for 40 years. "Stay, Ayana," he said quietly. "Stay because I want to know you when you are not holding up the whole town." Ayana looked down at their hands. His was smaller, warmer, but far from trembling. "Thomas," she paused, swallowing hard as something tender shifted inside her chest. "No one has ever asked me to stay before." Thomas replied softly, "Then let me be the first." And in the calm after the storm, under a sunset that painted the river gold, the giant Apache woman finally understood that some places are worth staying in, not because people need your strength, but because someone needs your presence. As the river slowly receded after the flood, dry crossing slipped back into its old rhythm. But among all the familiar sights, something new appeared, becoming part of the landscape just as naturally as the bridge itself. Ayana no longer left town. She did not continue north the way she once said she would. Each morning, her silhouette appeared on the dusty trail leading to Thomas's small diner. At first, she said she was just checking on the bridge. A few days later, she claimed she was bringing extra lumber for Thomas to fix a door. But after a week passed, she stopped searching for reasons. She simply came, and Thomas simply smiled every time he saw her standing in the doorway, brushing dust from her shoulder, eyes carrying a shy flicker as though she still was not used to being someone worth waiting for. One late afternoon, the two of them stood on the new bridge together. The sun was as red as a ribbon, spilling over the shallow water still lingering in the riverbed. Thomas leaned his arms on the railing and watched her shadow stretch across the fresh planks. "You know," he said softly, "ever since you saved this bridge, I started seeing dry crossing differently." It does not feel too quiet anymore. Ayana kept her gaze on the river. Different how? Different because you are here, Thomas answered without a pause. Ayana lowered her head, as if to hide the smile trying to rise. A breeze lifted a few strands of her hair. I am still not used to staying in one place for long, she murmured. Thomas looked at her with a kindness so gentle even a passerby could see it. If you want to go, I will not stop you. But if you stay, I will be grateful for every day you are here. Ayana turned toward him, her dark eyes deep as mountain stone. Then, without saying much at all, she placed her large hand over his. Just a small touch, but enough for Thomas to understand. She had chosen to stay, not for the town, not for the bridge, for him. After that day, everyone in Dry Crossing understood that Thomas's diner had become more than a diner. It was the place where Ayana often sat in the evenings with a cup of coffee in her hands, while Thomas stood behind the counter, pretending to refill the pot, but really watching her when he thought she would not notice. Folks passing by offered warm nods, no mocking jokes, no curious stares, only peace. The world sometimes changes because of a great storm or because of a woman strong enough to stand on a breaking bridge. But for Thomas, his world changed in the simplest way, when Ayana decided to walk through his door every morning. If you are still here in these final moments, then maybe the story of Ayana and Thomas has touched a quiet place in your heart. In the small towns of the West, people often think love belongs only to the young. But sometimes it finds those who believed they had missed it long ago, and it arrives on the very day they need it most. If this story reminded you of someone, or simply gave you a peaceful evening, I invite you to subscribe to Wild West Love Stories. Here we share gentle, heartfelt tales filled with kindness and the old Western spirit, made for hearts that have lived long enough to know love does not always come in a hurry. Thank you for staying with us until the end. I wish you a warm, restful night. And if you cross a bridge tomorrow, who knows? Your heart might be ready to begin a new journey of its own.